Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's a privilege to speak in this debate on the Constitution, Europe, External Affairs and Culture Committee's report on the Scottish Government's international work. I congratulate the committee, led by convener Claire Adamson, on a thorough and important piece of work. It is very wide-ranging, I think, as reflected in the diversity of speeches that we've enjoyed listening to this afternoon. The key themes emerging from the committee inquiry were the importance of adopting a strategic approach, the need for a prioritisation of policies to flow from that approach, an emphasis on effective collaboration across government to encourage policy coherence in relation to both external affairs and how this interacts with domestic priorities, challenges in measuring impact and on how to enhance scrutiny. Presiding Officer, Scotland is a nation with a strong European heritage outlook and values. People voted overwhelmingly to remain in the EU in 2016 and, of course, subsequently in every election following have endorsed the pro-European SNP. The committee report acknowledges the Scottish Government's position that the founding values of the EU, human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law and respect for human rights, are the Scottish Government's values. The publication of the Global Affairs Framework sets out with clarity the values and principles underpinning the Scottish Government's international work. I agree with the Cabinet Secretary that it's important to note that the Scottish Government's Global Affairs Framework is being published at a time when, in the face of the invasion of Ukraine, all nations are being tested on whether they support not just the principle, but the reality of adopting a rules-based approach to protect their values. As the new Global Affairs Framework sets out, and consistent with the evidence given to the committee inquiry, Scotland's international work will be guided by some key areas of focus: good global citizenship, maintaining the closest possible relationship with the European Union, gender equality, climate crisis and climate justice, respect for human rights and the rule of law, the role of our international networks and Scotland's culture. I'd like to focus my remarks on gender equality. The Scottish Government has stated its commitment to employing a feminist foreign policy for Scotland, fulfilling an SNP manifesto promise. Making Scotland the first country in the UK to adopt such a policy will join a small number of nations across the world, including Sweden, who were the first in the globe to do so in 2014. A feminist foreign policy includes moving away from what might traditionally be considered foreign policy and prioritising topics like peace, gender equality, environmental issues and human rights, focusing on the well-being of the world's most marginalised people, including women and girls. Thinking about foreign policy and international relations from the viewpoint of the world's most vulnerable groups, thereby taking an intersectional approach to challenging existing power structures such as racism, colonialism and male domination. Sweden's feminist foreign policy is based on the conviction that sustainable peace, security and development can never be achieved if half the world's population is excluded. The policy is a response to the discrimination and systematic subordination that still characterises everyday life for countless women and girls all over the world. Feminist foreign policy is an agenda for change to strengthen the rights, representation and resources for women and girls. There are many examples of Sweden's feminist foreign policy contributing positively to the world, including new legislation prohibiting the purchase of sexual services in several countries. Sweden has cooperated closely with countries reviewing their legislation on prostitution, and in recent years Ireland, France and Northern Ireland have adopted legislation that is equivalent to that in Sweden. They've improved opportunities to combat domestic violence in China, co-financing a study on employee and employer knowledge of China's legislation prohibiting domestic violence, with the aim of strengthening the private sector's efforts against violence. There have been hundreds of thousands fewer unwanted pregnancies in East Africa, with Sweden intensifying its work on sexual and reproductive health and rights. One example is that a Swedish-backed programme is estimated to have prevented hundreds of thousands of unwanted pregnancies and unsafe abortions in East Africa. And they have helped thousands of new midwives per year in Afghanistan, Myanmar, South Sudan, Zambia and other countries by funding training for midwives, leading to perhaps millions of women being able to give birth with the support of trained staff. I'd like to endorse the remarks made by my colleague Bill Kidd in terms of nuclear disarmament and trafficking and sexual exploitation. I understand that the Scottish Government will review Scottish Government policies and programmes where they have an international dimension to ensure that they reflect a feminist approach to foreign policy and that they will seek to learn from other countries in this area. In doing this, our Government needs to be alive to our domestic policies as well as international. While Scotland approaches this from a relatively privileged position and with some world-leading legislation and many sound policies, we are not there yet in terms of eradicating the discrimination and violence which is an everyday reality for far too many women and girls in Scotland. There is still a gap between policy intention and legislative reality in some areas, for example, equally safe. It's work in progress, which requires some urgency. Scotland's international work can create domestic opportunities and attract investment. Being a good global citizen and strengthening relationships with countries and continents can only be of benefit to the people of Scotland. Presiding Officer.